everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Dragonfire podcast. My name is Nathan Klambara, and I'm a reviewer and blogger at the Before We Go blog. And I'm joined, as always, by my co host, James Doolin, who is the author of No Heart for a Thief. And today we've got a really great episode for you. So, first up, we have a fantastic interview with Samit Basu, who is the author of the Jinn-Bot of Shantiport, which is coming out on October 3rd from Tordotcom Publishing. And then after that interview, James and I are going to be able to do a really cool Dragonfire segment where we're going to focus on some sci-fi topics. We usually focus a lot on fantasy, so we're having a little bit of a sci-fi special episode. So thanks for joining us. And yeah, let's get to the interview. And today we have a very special guest with us, author Samit Basu, who is the author of the upcoming Jinn-Bot of Shantiport, as well as the award-winning City Inside, which I only have on Kindle, so I don't have a physical copy to show for our YouTube viewers. But thank you for joining us. How are you today?
Well, thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here. I'm well. I have it's always deeply weird kind of releasing a book when you're physically sitting on the other side of the planet. And I think it takes all the imagination of a fantasy or science fiction person to even conceptually see how it's possible. But this is I've done this a few times now, and it's always deeply fun. So in short, I'm good.
Okay.
Well, we're glad you could spend some time with us. It's, we both got the chance to read your book a little bit early. It is, and for the listeners and the viewers, we need to plug this. It is coming out October 3rd. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So you're like 2 weeks away from the release date. How are you feeling about that?
I'm feeling the standard amount of tension, but after some point, and I've been doing this for 20 years. I started just when I was out of college. And after some time, you just get used to the sense of you have no control of what's going to happen. There is no point obsessively checking every corner of the internet to see what's going on. You do it anyway. It's not like I've risen above that at all. But I'm feeling relatively calm in the sense that it's been with the last book, there was a sense of I was in a sense debuting in the US because the previous books that had been out in the US hadn't got any kind of in genre attention. They've done all right, but this time I'm feeling a little more comfortable because there is a sense of having done this process once before. It feels a bit more sane.
Yeah. Well, I've been through the process, and I know it hasn't been sane on my end, but you've been doing it quite a lot longer than I have. So hats off to you.
Well, thank you. And spoiler alert, it never gets sane. Like sometimes
you can give me some hope. Come on.
No, but I mean, sometimes it's insane in a really good way. Yeah. But it's never something that you really get used to, and it's never something that is super logical, even when it's going well. So, I mean, I think living where I do, embracing the chaos is part of just what you have to do. I think working in Bollywood has just raised my chaos resistance levels to a point where I appreciate that publishing tries, but it can never match the sheer insanity of working in film. But this is not a challenge. This is not a challenge at all. I'm happy for it.
Well, I mean, I think that gets us off to the right point. We need a proper introduction. You're definitely a threat on multiple levels. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do, not only publishing, but in film?
Well, I do see myself primarily as a writer and a writer of fantasy and science fiction, because that's what I've been doing for the last 2 decades. I started just out of college. I wrote a fantasy novel called The Simicon Prophecies, which came out in India in 2003. This is my 7th, I want to say, genre book for adults. Yeah, it is. And my 4th one in the US. Apart from that, I've worked in comics, I've worked in film, where I kind of chanced into a director, screenwriter role after, well, I say chanced into, but it took me a decade of failing at it. And I continued to fail at it, even when I had the job. And I've done a bunch of other things. Nonfiction writing, children's writing, and so on. So I've been more or less a full-time writer for the last 2 decades. And for some insane reason, I seem to appear to want to keep doing it. So that's me in short. I've pretty much lived in India all my life. I studied in the UK. I live on the internet a lot, and yeah, that's me.
So how is that experience kind of stepping into directing and doing screenwriting changed your viewpoint on writing and the craft of putting together a book?
It's changed it a lot, but it's also I think fundamentally every time you step into a new genre or a new medium, it teaches you things that cause you to reevaluate your whole process, right? Like, in a way, comics writing is something that is the full set of writer training, because you're learning to, think spatially and think visuals first in a way that you don't have to when you're doing prose. Um,
Yeah.
so it really teaches you to examine your writing in a way that just absorbing writing theory and trying to internalize that in your writing process, that works, of course. But when you actually have to write a different way, or just really turn your brain around, that really makes a difference. That teaches you things about pacing and structure and compression that you wouldn't learn just from repeated prose practice. Screenwriting, I would say, is much the same. With direction, it's a whole other thing, because that's about 15 additional channels of chaos, right? And you see, you see exactly what the script means to a larger production where there are 17 balls you have to juggle at any given point of time. Um, and it's a humbling experience, really, because at so many times during the shooting of film, people are vaguely aware that a script exists, but it's basically live performance and rewriting and handling 20,000 different egos at the same time, and someone's missing, and 18 people are having tantrums at the same time, and you have to prioritize which one you need, because the light's also gone. Um, so that has been very educational, just as a human experience. I don't think that it's taught me anything about writing. Uh,
Your characters don't
but
act up the same way?
no, oh my God. While it's nice to feel like I work in 15 directions at the same time, I think if one is honest about it, um, what has happened a lot is that I worked in publishing until I'm broke. Then I've gone to other fields and returned to publishing when I'm just frustrated with how those other fields work. So while on the bright side, I can say, I learned so many different things. At the same time, it's like the act of writing, or actually creating in any form, is so rewarding in itself, and it's such a joy to experience things as a creator, or as a, I don't want to say consumer, but as a reader or listener, or the audience in whatever way. But then the moment you then try to run this through the meat grinder of a creative industry in any form, that's when the craziness sets in, right?
Yeah.
So, and it's not, I mean, working full time as a writer out of India is not something that people do. So in many of these situations, it's been about just trying to find ways to keep doing this when systems don't exist and infrastructure don't exist. And that actually informs my books a lot, because in most of my books, the characters are just bouncing around in a world that doesn't work, trying to make sense of it. So I think that goes into it.
Definitely.
Yeah, let's jump into your book. So, Jinn-Bot is essentially a sci-fi space opera retelling of Aladdin. And these kinds of modern retellings of myths, legends, fairy tales, fables, whatever, have been really popular in publishing recently. Why did you decide to do a retelling of the story of Aladdin?
I had been wanting to do a retelling for a while, as in it was on the list of things to do for the exact reason you mentioned, in the sense that these things seem to be really working now, and there's a lot of stories that haven't been done, because ultimately it always kind of boils down to the stories that are familiar. I think there's a broad awareness of, say, the Greek and Roman myths, of fairy tales, and of things like King Arthur legends, where there is this assumption of familiarity anywhere in the world, which is reasonable. And these stories keep getting retold. And the challenge with, and one of the things that you're supposed to do as an Indian writer, and when I say supposed to do it, I mean, is one of the things that publishing will allow you to do as an Indian writer is kind of retell Indian mythology. But that's not essentially the same thing as fantasy or science fiction, because it's active religion in India, as opposed to something that is much more a classical text that people don't have strong emotional feelings about. And it's a country that's in so much churn that, and the mythological icons of mainstream India have been co-opted into narratives of immensely disturbing kind of social violence. So I kind of feel uncomfortable about that. So I was looking for a story that I thought everyone anywhere in the world would be familiar with. But that I also had a certain emotional connection to. So Aladdin and the 1001 Nights in general are stories that I had first experienced as a child growing up in Bengali, because in each language there are different kind of global channels of communication that don't always relate to English publishing, which is broadly US centric, which used to be kind of US and UK centric, I think 2 decades ago, more than it is now, where it's much more the US is the primary source of publishing in the world. So Aladdin was a story that I'd always, among a set of Arabian Nights fables that I'd always really liked. And this was, of course, I think the early 90s was when the Disney Aladdin came out, 90 or 91. And that was, I think, the first animated movie I saw in a theater. And it was also the first animated movie where, vaguely speaking, the characters looked a bit like me. And so I read more about Aladdin, and I found out that it kind of isn't a 1001 Nights story, as in it was added on to the French translation of the fables by a Syrian Christian guy who, I don't want to say he was a hustler, but it just sounds like he was. Like it was he added the story to the collection. And that's why it's kind of different from all the other stories in the collection, which are much more rooted in, which are much more similar to each other culturally. Whereas, and then when you add the Disneyfication of it, then Aladdin becomes this kind of homeless Orientalist fable, which because even in the 1001 Nights, it's set in China. Everyone has vaguely Muslim sounding names. It makes no sense. And that's just the kind of story I like, because this kind of loose Orientalist, we take in images and story fragments from everywhere, and then we just make something up. That sounds like modern production to me. So I got very into that, especially because I had this emotional connection with the story from my childhood. And because it didn't work. Like, I did not like the wishes that Aladdin made, whether in the original fable, where it wasn't 3 wishes, where he was just doing stuff. And all of it was quite horrible if you looked at it. If you looked at the situation where he was from, he was quite a sociopath. And if you strip away the beautiful music and the cute imagery of the Disney films, he's quite a sociopath in that as well. So I wanted to look at an Aladdin who was in a city that needed changing, that needed kind of, social justice from the ground up, and not an Aladdin who was just, okay, I want, to be a famous celebrity and trick the lovely innocent princess into a relationship with me, and perform extremely questionable decisions about setting a wild magical power free minutes after seeing how dangerous that could be in the final action sequence. So this needed fixing, right? So that's where this book came from. I decided to take this roaming Orientalist fable and set it in a far future version of the city that I grew up in, which is Kolkata, in the east of India. And yeah, that was a very long and rambling answer. I'm sorry, but that's
it was a very entertaining answer.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I like the background that you're able to give, and I guess I haven't thought of Aladdin as a sociopath before, but it's an interesting analysis to think about him in
Because
that
he's so cute.
lens.
It's because he's cute, and you're more distracted by the fact that the cartoon version doesn't have nipples, and then you don't realize that his agenda is not a good one.
Yeah, and the singing, of course, the
Yeah.
singing, which I'm
Why
gonna
are they
complain.
doing
There were
classic
no
Hollywood?
songs in your book. There was no singing. What happened?
I'm sorry about that. I mean, I would have put it in if I could have.
Not even a rap number like the
Yes,
latest version of Aladdin.
yeah. I'm my I could not trick myself into believing I had any rapping abilities, even in my imagination. That's why that doesn't exist.
That's a fair answer. Um, I think one of the things that's really interesting about your story is the point of view you chose. So essentially, and this is not spoiler for anybody. It's told from the perspective of this really advanced drone bot that kind of follows your main characters around, and so it has this kind of outside perspective, but at the same time it's sentient, so it has thoughts of its own. Why did you choose to use that method of storytelling, to use that point of view?
Um, yeah, I wanted to use I wanted to I wanted the point of view in terms of observing the characters to be as neutral as possible. So I wanted to start off with an observing point where um the central character you could not understand what the central character was up to. You could just observe their actions because Moku, which is the name of the character you refer to, which is a story bot who can read the minds of other bots and who thinks he can understand humans perfectly by observing their body language and just analyzing their tone and everything like that. Um, and I wanted to look at it as, especially when we're looking at stories where doesn't matter what part of the world you're from, you're looking at a different culture, right? Um, and you're trying to apply um, techniques of understanding and seeing through that character's eyes, which you can only really bring from your own context. And I wanted the person doing that to be someone who did not have context, but who had confidence, And because a lot of the story was about, what are the lines between a human active protagonist and a non-human inactive protagonist in a city where most of the people are just seen as passive subjects by the people in charge, right? And this is always an issue when you're telling stories in the supposed East. So I wanted to have this point of view character who were looking at these two different siblings, where he could observe the human, but not really understand her. And he was completely reading the thoughts of the other protagonist, which is Badur, the monkey bot, who is Lena's brother. Which of course changes down the line because there is a sense of, because when we're engaging with any text, I always find it very interesting how increasingly now writers don't trust readers to figure out what's going on and just tell them all the time what the character is thinking and feeling and what their goals are, just really large font underlined, laying it down in every chapter. And I see why that happens, and but it's also the kind of thing where you don't assume that the reader can pick it up. So I wanted to play with two very different ways of dealing with the same situation. And I had vague thoughts when I started off, the whole thing being a bit like a mockumentary.
Okay.
But I decided that there were enough elements in the story for me to not add an additional layer of complexity. So I didn't go with a mockumentary in the end. But yeah, but that's why. That's why. I mean, I wanted him to be able to literally fly between the two main characters, and I wanted their stories to feel a little different because one was human and he couldn't understand her, and one was a bot and he could initially understand everything about it.
and knowing that you work in film, it almost felt like you were like pointing the camera at these characters rather than being in their head. And it was that's so that I don't know if that's what you're going for in a way, but I think it's interesting that to know your background and to see that perspective.
No, absolutely. No, you've outlined it in a sentence much better than I did in the last few minutes. It feels like I was pointing the camera at them literally because I mean Moku was my camera. And I wanted it to be I wanted in one case to gradually understand the character and with the other to absolutely be in his head.
Yeah.
Because he had feelings about a lot of things that also helped with the world building.
And I think that kind of brings me to another question I had about kind of one of the themes of this book, I think, is what is personhood,
Yeah,
and what is family, and you are kind of in these characters' heads, one being a robot, a automaton, monkey, and another being like this storytelling bot, and another being a human. And they, first of all, they call each other family, even though one is made and one is not. And so I was interested, what is that analogous to something in this real world that you're trying to dig into? Is that a theme that you're trying to explore through this other telling of bots and faraway lands, or are you what is it you're trying to communicate through that?
right. Well, I mean, it kind of starts with both the fable of Aladdin and the setting where I'm putting the story, right? With the fable of Aladdin itself and this idea where you use wishes to control the reality that you're in, right? One of the most troubling things that I found when I was dealing with this just as a storyteller and trying to feel sympathy and engagement and warmth for the characters that I was dealing with, that this is a horrifying power. Yeah. So that was where I started thinking about, who has agency in the story, whose thoughts can we deliberately control and manipulate, what large sections of the population will just have to obey us if we give them orders. And that was really why it turned into why it became a far future uh, retelling instead of a fantasy retelling. Because if you're looking at a society where you have the ability to control the population literally, and there are various strata of society where you have varying degrees of control over them. What rights do people have, and if you can control people, and if there's a lot of technology, so even the humans are kind of technologically enhanced depending on their social status, right? So
Mhm.
so that's why the bots came into the story at all, and it became a story about, well, one of the aspects of the story became about personhood and agency. Who has what rights in a situation like this? Who's in control of these rights? What rights can you just change with the flip of a switch or a delivered instruction? And so yeah, so that's where that came from.
Yes. Yeah. Speaking of kind of robots and things, this book is coming out in a time of great kind of social unrest and upheaval and worry because of things like ChatGPT and other kinds of artificial intelligence. While working on this book, did you do any kinds of research into AI technologies and kind of what's actually possible, or did you just like let your imagination run wild about what potential AI might be in the future?
I had huge mounds of unused research left over from my last book, which was about near future India, and so yeah, so there was a certain amount of research into AI, and which led me to the premise that the humans and the people in power in this world did not like AI and did not like robots, which I think is going to just be a thing going forward, even as industries build more advanced AIs, whatever they're capable of. Um, People are not going to like them. Um, I wouldn't like them in their place. Um, so I think the way that the present day very reasonable dislike of AI affected the book was that one, it led me to make everyone a cyborg. So even Badur, I'm calling him a bot because he's built, but his cultural programming and his active DNA has meat bits, which is interesting to me. At what point does either an organic person with technology augments or a built person with fleshy bits that doesn't understand, where everyone has vast organic, let's say, emotions that come from the same cultural frameworks of consumption. Because Badr has become the person he is through parental training, consuming pop culture like Murderbot, um, and living in a city where everyone goes through the same things. So I mean, and so that's a line that I find very interesting because where do we start? I mean, we're already at the point in the real world where the technological augments we use to make our life supposedly easier are both allowing, sinister forces to kind of control our behavior and making our life more convenient. So at some point, these augments are going to move on and then into our bodies. So there's one whole, bundle of arguments proceeding from there. And on the other, the absolutely robotic things are going to be trained on human behavior patterns and carry human flaws and human biases. So yeah, so as a person, I dislike AI. So the way that um, went into the book was that everyone in the book dislikes AI, and AI often dislikes itself.
Interesting.
Yeah, this book is different than your previous book, The City Inside, because The City Inside was much more like near future, right? Like it was much, I don't want to say it was more grounded, but both, I guess, literally and figuratively, it was more grounded. How was writing Jinn-Bot, which is set in a much more far future space opera style, different than The City Inside? Was it more difficult, or did it allow you to explore things that you weren't able in a more near future setting?
Oh, the difference was that I really enjoyed writing Jinn-Bot, which is much more. So I still see myself fundamentally as a fantasy writer, and really enjoying the let's say less constrained chaos that fantasy allows you to create. So the City Inside was very different from anything else I've written, and all my books tend to be quite different from one another. But um, with the City Inside, I think it was very different because I'm talking about so many real world issues, and it was important to foreground those issues. So plot took a backseat. Um, Characters were very carefully based on real people that I knew. Um, and there was less running wild in the sense that when you're talking about so many grim things, you can't really go for absolute comedy or just, embrace the ridiculousness of the whole thing. So with Jinn-Bot, I had much more fun because yes, there is a fair amount of space given to climate change and oligarchy and colonialism and personhood and serious themes with single capital letters. But the my favorite thing about fantasy or sci-fi for that matter is that it allows you to embrace the batshit.
Yeah.
So it was very nice after really kind of trying to be very contained and very serious and very I must mention this aspect of society today in City Inside to say, okay, I'm gonna have characters who are nuts. I'm gonna have a big plot with twists. I'm gonna have really strange creatures all over the place and action scenes and running around in drones and you know all the nut stuff that is in Jinn-Bot. So yeah, so Jinn-Bot is more how I would normally write, I want to say, and it's certainly and I it was so nice coming back to that because City Inside was also a book where I felt like I needed to write it because of the state that my country's in. um Jinn-Bot has no such important feelings. It's like I want to have fun with the book again was my guiding light going into it.
So you want to write more giant garbage collecting melee machines?
Always, always. It was it was deeply frustrating to me that I couldn't put any of those into the city inside without completely, taking the limelight away from important things that needed our attention and thought. No, I mean, the as an Indian or South Asian writer specifically, there's fantasy and sci-fi are not on the list of things you're supposed to write. And if one is going to do that anyway, and immediately kind of fall outside whatever few cultural institutions are there to support writing and literature in all its forms, then one might as well go all the way. A garbage kaiju is important, and it's representation.
I mean, and with you saying that, we're seeing kind of an influx of new Southeastern writers hitting the scene and making kind of a big splash. You have Sons of Darkness, The Phoenix King, The First Binding, all kind of making a splash, especially at least in the US context from what we're seeing. What do you think that means for the future of fantasy and science fiction in India?
The future of fantasy and science fiction in India is not very bright at this point of time because our publishing is kind of going into a decline because of larger social and political forces. So the impact that South Asian writers have been having in the US and UK, it's delightful to me as someone who's wanted to see this sort of thing for 2 decades, and I've been around for most of it slowly growing. But in India, at this point, it doesn't really make a difference. Maybe when things change socially, there'll be an influx. But yeah, India is not a good place for any kind of free running imagination right now. But just, as just watching all the writers you mentioned, plus people like Bhadra Chandrasekera from Sri Lanka, Lavanya Lakshmi Narayan, who also had a book out this year, which, I mean, these are just lovely books, all of them. And I think what is super interesting to me about them is, well, many things actually, but one is that they're all very different from one another, because they're coming at a time where fantasy, like science fiction, is just, it's moving in 80 different directions at the same time all at once, right? And every now and then, people try to do trend analysis of what's happening, and this genre is hot, and that kind of book is hot, and there are always 2 or 3 things every year, but actually no one knows what's happening. It's like an amoeba that's moving in a lot of directions, and you can only analyze post fact. It's impossible to predict where it's coming from, and it's nice to see that none of these writers are really bound by their ethnicity to retell the same sort of story, in the way that when South Asian literature broke out in Litpic in the 90s, one very legitimate criticism you could make about all those books is that they were pretty similar in the themes that they addressed, which was what Western publishing wanted to read from South Asia at this time. But we now live in a bizarre world where no one even knows how publishing works. So all the writers you mentioned, they've all come up in different ways because there's no single institution through which people are kind of filtered and gate kept and so on. So, and personally speaking, apart from just loving that this is happening, it's been so the last 20 years, right? So 20 years ago, when I submitted my first novel to publishers outside India, there was this blanket refusal to even accept that Indians could write this sort of book. So like, this is not the kind of book we expect from Indian writers. We don't know what the Indian audience is. No one is asking you to know what the Indian audience is, right? If you like the book. So I would get these rejections saying, okay, we like your book, but we have no idea how to sell it because nothing like it has been done before. And to my very young, uninformed perspective, that was the point. Surely someone, if you like a book and it's not been done before, is that not a good thing? And then the last 2 decades have been about understanding how it's not, So a decade or so ago, when I first kind of broke through into the UK and the US, and it was Titan Books, which was then a small publisher, it's much bigger now. It was a lovely experience to work with them because, again, things are just more chaotic over here. So, and if you cut forward another decade and you see, I don't know, I can immediately think of 10, 20, 30 South Asian writers, some of whom are some of whom live in the subcontinent, but the majority of whom actually live in the West, in the US and the UK, who are doing fascinating work in 100 different traditions at the same time. And I like that. I mean, I like that we're kind of assembling from just different directions at the same time. What makes it difficult though is that if you stick us all together in the same, the skin tone based group panel, there's very little we have in common to talk about because our works are wildly different. So it's good that Ronnie's book and Gaurav's book and Aparna's book are coming out in the same year because they still have sort of thematic overlaps. But Kritika's book, which was also out this year.
We had her on the channel as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't heard that one yet, but I saw her link there. But her book is lovely, but it's not the same. It's not.
No.
They're not informed by the same backgrounds at all, and I think that's great.
And so, given all that chaos that you're talking about, and the wild different directions that fantasy and sci-fi are going, is there anything that's kind of off limits for you in terms of what you want to get into? Do you consider grimdark an option in the future? Do you consider different possibilities of, wild portal fantasies, or is there anything that you don't think is within what you would want to write?
I don't know. See, the thing is, again, this is possibly generational, but I don't think in genre terms in particular, because when I was growing up, we did not have bookstores locally that were divided by genre. That was a thing that started happening in India when I was in my 20s, so to speak. Right. So the whole conversation about subgenres and your grimdark and steampunk was trending a while ago. Various other punks have come and gone. Cyberpunk has resurfaced and so on. So these are mostly things that I find out after the book is written. So to answer your question, no, there is absolutely no genre that I wouldn't feel like trying out. But having said that, when I speak to publishers have a better sense of the kind of audience that each genre has. So, and it's not something that it's possibly safe for them to articulate because no one likes being put into a category as a writer or a reader. But you get these vibes like, okay, maybe the audience of X subgenre isn't where you want to go right now, right? And these are not conversations that they can either actually tell you, don't write this genre. The audience will not like you as a human. Because it's probably not true, right? If they tried a bunch of books from various other people in those genres, it probably work out fine, because these but they don't want to because publishing is a risk-averse industry. But from a creative point of view, I think all of these are fascinating. Whenever I read across genres, and whenever I read something that's exciting in any genre, of course my immediate, I got to do one of those. I have to do one of those right now. It'll only take me at least a year, probably 2 to do it. So I should think before jumping into this relationship, but that's not how my reader to writer transition brain works. So whenever I read all these books, I go, aha,
yeah,
this is what I want to do next. So currently I'm working on what I suspect will turn out to be a portal fantasy book.
Okay.
But when I'm reading grimdark, I'm like, I want to do grimdark. But you give me any, I was just reading Travis Baldry's book, and I'm like, I want to do one of these. So that's my internal pre-decision choice problem.
Yeah, I don't know if grimdark cozy fantasy go together.
Yeah, but I want to write both.
The cozy fantasy that tackles oppression and colonialism.
Yes. I don't want to write a cozy grimdark. I don't think that could work. But yeah.
But it's interesting because I don't see many, at least larger name authors who seem to either want to or are allowed to write in many different subgenres. So you do have your Neil Gaimans who kind of stick out as somebody who's written in a lot of different subgenres and a lot of different tones, but a lot of authors feel streamlined into one kind of tone. Do you feel like you've been able to kind of express yourself in many different tones throughout your career?
Yeah, there's a certain freedom when no one knows what to do with you. Um, in the sense that so one thing that happens, I think, is that if you're writing in a genre where it's fairly easy to predict what will happen, what could happen to your book. Like in many spaces, an editor or anyone could really look at your book and say, okay, this could sell X number of copies, so this is how we market it. This is the kind of cover we put on it. This is exactly how the whole production process goes. So in those situations, the challenge for the writer becomes, how do I get better at my craft? How do I get marginally better at promotions or whatever it is? How do I organize my time better? This is one layer of writer problem. But I think I'm just used to, over the last 2 decades, no one really knowing where I would fit. And while there's plenty of, I mean, one could always complain about that, right? Like pretty much every field I work in, no one is exactly sure what to do with me, but they're like, all right, come in and do your thing and just shut up. But that, so there's a certain freedom that gives you as well.
Yeah.
So let's say, if at some magical point of time, um, one of my books becomes a raging bestseller in the US or something like that, right? At that point of time, there'll certainly be more pressure on me to stick to the genre that I'm in, because that's the point at which finally, okay, you have found your audience. But as long as I'm not one of the authors getting those massive book deals, the risk is actually less, in the sense that, all right, let's he wants to do something else that's strange, let's let him, because we're not putting millions of dollars on this. So so that freedom is something actually that I've learned to take positively when I'm moving across both genres and media, in the sense that if they don't know what to do with you, then there is a certain freedom to be embraced in that. But I mean, I was lucky in the sense that my first novel was actually a bestseller in India. And because at the time I was not very genre aware, the next book I was planning was actually, at that point, it was not a fantasy novel. It was I think it was possibly a coming of age mystery something. I don't even remember. Um, and then my publisher said, no, write a sequel to the book that you just wrote, and that you know has somehow managed to hit #1. So because that's what you have to do next. So I look forward to having the same problem in other parts of the world, because that means I'm earning really well. Um, but until such time, I find that just trying new things helps keep my love for writing alive, because there, especially if you do it full time, it can become such a grind, I mean, and just I should write, I don't know, 5,000 more words this week. I need to care what those 5,000 words are.
Yeah.
And moving into new genres and moving into new media helps keep it exciting, because you're always learning. It's nice to feel that, after 2 decades, well, it's nice for me. I hope it's nice for readers. It's nice to feel like I don't really know anything about what I'm doing. Um, because that means every time I write a book, I change my process a little bit. I look forward to making so much money that I have to stop and just repeat myself over and over again. Uh, but it's
I'll knock on
fine
some
until
wood
that
for you.
point as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So after you write your portal fantasy, your grimdark fantasy, and your cozy fantasy, would you ever think about maybe returning to like the universe of Jinn-Bot? Because it's a big story, but it's also a relatively contained story, and there's a lot of talk about like a much larger universe out there. Would you ever return to it and explore something else in this world?
Oh yeah, I'd love to return to that right away. I'm very happy to, like, I know what the next 2 books in this universe would be. Well, when I say I know a few paragraphs worth of it. But also I want to make sure, just from a pragmatic point of view, that if I'm doing a series, um, I want to make sure that I know the audience is there and what it wants. Um, because I've had the experience of writing series before without much publisher support, and that can be a pretty depressing experience. And I'm talking about my first few books in India. And it was not like the publisher wasn't supportive. It was just that fantasy didn't exist as genre in India, and they didn't know how to find an audience or how to support the books. But it can get pretty bleak, because you commit years of your life to doing this, and it's a repetition of the same experience. And writing novels is such a lonely experience. And when the self-doubt, I mean, there's always a healthy amount of self-doubt, I think, but um, when it's amplified by years of kind of going deeper and deeper in the same tunnel, then it can get quite lonely and depressing. So pretty much, I mean, apart from the city inside, pretty much any book I've written, I've always kind of left a few, potholes and cave openings and windows in case I want to jump through them and just go further into it. So yeah, when I now say that I want to write a portal fantasy and a grimdark fantasy and a cozy fantasy, that could change next week.
Lots of freedom, lots of open windows.
Are your other ideas for the Jinn-Bot universe also retellings of other things? Okay, they'd be completely original.
No, not really. In the sense that I know what the meat of what the central through line of those plots would be, and if I can find a retelling that also works with those, I'll stick that on as well. But that's not a primary goal, in the sense that I feel like if when you're going into the second book of anything, you're not there for anything beyond at most a real love for the characters and desire to live in the world with them, and maybe a central burning question of what happens next. So I don't want to. So if I do that sequel, I'm gonna figure out what the story is first, and then if there's a fable that ties on to that reasonably easily, I'll layer that on as well. But that's not a fundamental goal. Like, it would be what happens to these people.
Very cool. I think that I hope that your book finds an audience here and in the UK and worldwide. I hope that you find a lot of success with it. It was a lot of fun. I think that you did some really interesting things with at least what we know of the Aladdin story, from Disney and that kind of thing. Many of us are aware of that because of Disney, but I think you did a lot of really cool things in it. So I hope that hits with audiences. But as you have said, it's not up to you. It's up to the fates, I guess. Right.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And the same with your next book.
Oh, thank you.
Do you know what that is? Do you want to?
Well, my next book is out on October 24th. It's a sequel to my first book.
Oh, congratulations.
So yeah, I'm excited for it, but it's indie scale is a little bit different, so let's hope that it finds a readership as well. But I hope that you launch your way to the top of some bestseller lists over here as well.
Thank you. I hope so too. And indie is, again, I've always wanted to go indie. I'm just terrified of how much work it is.
It's a lot of work. I mean, well, the three authors that we had talked about before, Ronnie, I'm forgetting the author's name of Phoenix King and Aparna and Sons of Darkness. Gaurav, yeah, they all started in indie. I think Ronnie, not this book, but Ronnie started with some urban fiction, urban fantasies, and then the other two were originally published indie. So it's interesting to see what's happening with that as well.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's because I'm on the other side of the planet, and there are no cons and networks and kind of trustable info sources of how to go about it, and no one's really done it here. It's just something I look on from afar with wonder and think it's a lot of work. It's a lot of extra work. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for spending your time with us. And Nathan, did you have any last burning questions?
Don't think so. I think we hit everything. So thank you for joining us. So just to plug the book again, it's the Jinn-Bot of Shantiport. It's coming out from Tordotcom on October 3rd. So make sure that you pre-order it or pick it up. So Samit, thank you again for joining us on the Dragonfire podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I just had a lovely time.
I had such a great time listening to you. You have a lot of great stories, and I'm interested to have you back.
Anytime.
All right. Thank you for listening to that amazing interview with Samit Basu. We really loved his book, the oh gosh, I'm missing the title. The Jinn-Bot of
Shantiport.
Shantiport.
Yeah.
What? The
Shantiport.
Jinn-Bot of Shantiport?
Yeah, I've been just calling it Jinn-Bot the whole. If you have, I just
Okay.
through the whole interview, I just called it Jinn-Bot. So if you just want to be like, and we kind of
Okay.
have hit the book enough, I think that if you just say, yeah,
Okay.
about his upcoming, his upcoming book, I think it's good enough.
Yeah. All right. Do you want to restart or should I just cut it off?
I'll just cut it off at this point. It's
Okay.
easier with your files.
Okay. Thank you all for sticking around and listening to our amazing interview with Samit Basu. We're really excited for his book on October 3rd. And without further ado, we'd love to get to Dragonfire. We're going to hit some sci-fi topics and really get into it. So, Nathan, you want to put some time on the clock?
Yeah.
All right.
So
So it's been a while since it's just been the two of us. Let's see what we can get
yeah.
into. And this is a softball question. So, what sci-fi invention of convenience, so it can't be like some wild thing that's going to change the world, uh, would you like the most?
Yeah. For me, it's any sci-fi movie, TV show, book, or whatever, where like the people just like get like food automatically. Like they just put in like nothing, like powder, and then it just like magically turns into like a 5-course meal because I hate I hate cooking, especially like daily cooking, but also I just don't want to eat leftovers all the time. So I think for me, it would definitely be like the magic food thing
Yeah.
that you see in sci-fi things. That would be like the smallest convenience that would just like make my life infinitely better.
So it's interesting because I chose a similar thing, but immediately when you started talking, my mind just went to Demolition Man and Taco Bell being like the food of choice of the future.
Yeah.
And it has nothing to do with what you just said, but for some reason, like Taco Bell high quality just kind of snuck into my mind. But I chose the replicator from Star Trek.
Hmm.
Um, and not only is it like food, but it also can do like machine parts and things like that. So uh very, very sustainable choices.
Awesome. All right. So for our next question, it is if you could have time travel, teleportation, or faster than light travel, which would you choose?
And I apologize for being redundant in this question. I think it's like the exact same as the last question, just a little bit more specific and a
Yeah.
little bit more grand. Um,
Yeah.
but I think I'm not interested in time travel. I think going back in time outside of some very specific instances is going to be disastrous. Going forward in time, I am not positive about what this future is
Nope.
going to hold. I think it's going to be pretty disastrous as well. So, given my poor outlook on the world, that's off limits. Faster than light travel sounds cool, but I really have no interest in being on a spaceship or leaving. I don't like flying long distances on an airplane. So I'm not interested in going to outer space. So I'm gonna go teleportation. I would love to be able to travel the world in an instant. That's what I'm going with.
Yeah. I had to think about this one because I think like job wise, as an archaeologist, time travel will make my job infinitely easier. Uh,
You can
but
be
I
the
think I
Indiana
would,
Jones of time travel.
yeah, I think like, but I think I would go with teleportation because like I don't know what I would use faster than light travel for. Like right now, I don't even like leaving my house most of the time. So like where am I going? Like why do I even need that for? And so like teleportation, like I could like teleport from like my living room to the kitchen and then back again. Um, like that would be like super easy. Like I mean, like I guess like all three of these I don't really have a use for. I'm kind of too boring to make
You're
any
just trying to eliminate walking is
yeah, I
is the
guess that's it.
goal.
That's at the end of the day.
Okay, that's an interesting answer. Uh,
Yeah.
well, never getting your steps in.
Oh no. Yeah. See, so yeah, I guess like I think for me, it's like a lot of sci-fi inventions I just wouldn't find particularly useful for my boring 70-year-old in a younger person's body kind of thing that I've got going on.
To be fair, I think that that's what a lot of people would use these conveniences for, is like really minor things that wouldn't change their lives. I like to think that, like Omni-Man, I would like fly to Italy and get a bottle of wine for dinner. Like,
Yeah.
probably not. Like, I probably wouldn't just be spending lunch in Japan at the best sushi restaurant. I'd probably just like, okay, I don't have to take the train into work anymore.
Yeah. Yeah,
Which
because
is
I
probably a sad use of that technology.
because I'm not like, even if I had the power of flight, I'm not going to Italy for a bottle of wine. Like I won't even drive down the street to the local store to get a bottle of wine. Like, like it would be too much of a convenience even if I had the power of flight. I
So
know myself.
at the very least, we are safe from alcoholism because of our laziness and our
Laziness.
ineptitude. Um, so that's one thing that I'll take from that positively. Or
All right.
the next one, uh, also a negative framed question. What franchise would you stop from making any more movies or TV shows?
Um, I mean, I think there's like the obvious ones like DC. But it's like just give up the ghost at this point. Um, but it related to that, I'd probably say Marvel. I don't think the MCU is going anywhere. I don't think it's really had a point in a while. Um, I'm kind of burnt out by it. It seems like the people behind the scenes are burnt out by it. So I would probably go with those, to be completely honest.
See, with Marvel, I think that there's room. They're just not taking any chances and they don't want to. Like, they could make some really cool, different genre movies and bend things and like do interesting things with those characters that they just choose not to. Um, so I think there's a chance for something interesting. What I don't think has a chance for something interesting is James Bond.
Hmm.
I I have not seen a very interesting Bond movie in a very long time. Um, and they're not interested in doing anything with the character that's very new. I mean, I think Daniel Craig was a bit of a departure from what they used to do for a movie. And then they got right back into the same kind of like, let's have a laser that kills the world off kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it forgets that it can do different things. And so I'm done with James Bond. I'm fine with never having another movie or anything around that property.
Yeah, I was reading something a while ago about all the conflicts around James Bond right now, because I guess like Amazon technically owns it, but it's also owned by like a private family trust. So like corporate wise, Amazon controls it, but the family owns it creatively, and the two of them have like very different viewpoints about what to do with it moving forward. Hmm.
Well, good. So it doesn't have to move forward.
I don't know what's going on with that, but I feel like there's just like at this point, James Bond is just like almost become the generic spy genre that it birthed.
Yeah.
Um,
And there are so many other versions of that that are better. Like I think, and it's not the same kind of genre, but I think Luther does a better job of that, like really gritty kind of detective noir, or not noir, but detective kind of story that it kind of digs you into this world that seems like the stakes are far above beyond the main character. There are a lot of things like that that do it better.
yeah. And I think James Bond in the modern world, it's just also hard to make it work where like you can't just keep making like the stereotypical Eastern European or the brown person the villain. And I don't think they've quite figured out how to not do that, for a sustained
Yeah.
time. So
It also lost its campiness, which I think was part of the fun of the old movies.
yeah, the
Like,
60s-ness of it all.
yes, Sean Connery just jetpacking off in this really ridiculous way.
Yeah. All right. Well, now that we've had a question of negativity. Let's have another positive question. So, what's a character that stuck with you over the years, and what makes them stick?
So I'm gonna skip genre altogether and go for Bigger from Native Son. I think, and for those of you who haven't read Bigger or haven't read Native Son by Richard Wright, please do. Bigger was the first character, the first main character I was introduced to, where you're reading from his POV, and he's a objectively bad person throughout most of the book, and but you're also forced to reconcile the horrible things he does with the racism that he faces, and forced to see the humanity in him even as he does these horribly violent things to people inside and outside of his community. And so I think he's a character that will always stick with me.
Yeah. I feel like mine is so stereotypical for us because like my brain kept going back to Fitz from like Robin Hobb, which I feel like that's all we talk about. But like seriously, like I think that's a character that
Yeah.
I just can't get out of my head. And I think it's because we do spend a lot of time in Fitz's head, and Fitz is also really, really complex. I think that we get to experience him over nearly his entire lifespan.
Yeah.
Those books are also quite chunky after the first one or two of them. And I think when you just spend that much time with such a complex character through the highs and the lows and them going through it and them also being kind of a dumbass and you just like they just stick with you. And I don't know if I've ever had a character that did that.
Mm.
Especially as most main characters that you would spend that much time with tend to be relatively blank canvases that
Yeah.
I think that authors want to use as like an insert for the reader. And I
Yeah.
don't think Robin Hobb does that at all with how Fitz is presented in that book. And so I think he comes across really 3D and fully realized in a way that most other main characters don't.
I mean, you could have used this time to say Kalo, but you decided not to, and I'm going to take that as a
Yeah.
personal affront.
Yeah. I mean,
Personal.
I could have, but I didn't. And
Fine, be that way.
all right.
We'll go on to the next question then.
Yeah.
Um, this is your hostile edition of Dragonfire. So, what is your favorite robot character from any book, TV show, or movie?
I went with number 6 from Battlestar Galactica, the
Okay.
reimagined one. I don't know. I mean, I think it's just because one, I think the actress is Trisha Helfer, and I think her performance is so layered and nuanced that I really, really enjoyed. Um, I thought that the way that they wrote in those early Cylons in the reimagined Battlestar Galactica was just really interesting when they were like, ooh, like the Cylons have a plan. At the beginning of every episode, they were like, these are the Cylons and they have a plan. And before you realize that the writers didn't have a plan for them and that there was no plan all along, I thought she was just a really interesting character that, similar to what we were talking to Samit Basu about, was just this idea of personhood and humanity and how she was simultaneously done with this idea of humanness, but very much attached to this idea of personhood. And I thought that there was just like some really interesting, complex ideas there in those early seasons.
Interesting. I went with a less serious character. Went with Marvin from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah.
I just think the idea of like this depressed, nihilistic kind of robot is very interesting to me. I think that Alan Rickman being the voice for Marvin in the movie was just perfect casting. So I really enjoyed that, and I think that Martha Wells owes Marvin a little bit of a credit for being there and doing the depressed robot thing first. um,
Yeah.
in a much different way. But yeah, I really enjoy Marvin.
Yeah. I know that this wasn't the point of the question, but I will say probably one of my probably most controversial opinions is that I'm not the biggest fan of Murderbot. Um,
Yeah, I
I
haven't
think
read it yet.
okay. I think it was fun for one novella, but I think the shtick got a little old really, really quickly. So I'm sorry to everybody who's a huge Murderbot fan out there. But I've read like the first five novellas and the actual like novel. So I put in my time. Like I'm saying this from like a position of knowing what I'm talking about. But yeah, I just never really got it to the same degree that everyone else did. But yeah,
Do you hear that? It's the sound of you being canceled
I
right
know.
now,
I'm sorry.
just for that opinion.
I'm sorry, everyone. I mean, I did enjoy the first one. It just I felt like the it never really progressed beyond that, like that one little like a haha, like sad depressed murder robot, you know? Uh, but yeah, that's my
Well,
opinion.
we'll put up the address where you can send your complaint letters later.
Yeah. All
I
right.
think this
So
next one's you. Yeah.
yeah, so for our last question, what's a book that you could talk about for hours?
So again, I went outside of genre. One, because one of the first books that popped up to mind is the book that we did talk about for hours just like 2 episodes ago, which was City, Jade War, and Jade Legacy. Um, so I went outside of genre a little bit. The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde is one of my favorite novels. I've actually, when I was working in higher ed, I taught a freshman seminar using that book. And oddly enough, I think there's some more interesting nuance to be had now that you've had kind of some calls for like the end of the Me Too, like the Me Too kind of caught Juno Diaz in it a little bit with some of his not like criminal behavior, but like creepy behavior towards some women. And so I think that there's some interesting reading about he kind of writes this from what he was claiming was a feminist perspective, and now given that light, I think there's some interesting conversation that can be had about the characters within the Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, given the idea that Juno Diaz might not be such a safe man to be around, and so there's some interesting layers upon that. But I think it's just such a meaty book that it can be digested in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. For this one, I picked whatever was the last book that I read because any book prior to that I could not talk to you about for hours because I don't remember enough. So literally, if I finish a book, I could go off for hours about any book. Because I'll find something, whether I liked it, whether I didn't like it. But like even like when we're about to interview an author, if I don't write the interview questions as soon as I close that book, I don't remember anything. I don't remember character names. I remember like the vibes and the feelings that I get from it, but I don't really remember anything else, you know?
Except if any of those authors are listening right now, we 100% remember everything about your book and we loved
Yeah.
it.
I remember the feelings of how much it brought me joy. I don't
That's
remember
good.
any plot points from it, but I remember the feelings that it gave me and the fuzzies and the, everything like that.
So there's no book that you feel like you like have in the reservoir.
I mean, that's the problem is that I mean, like, other than the ones that are like really long series that have big prominence. So obviously I could talk to hours about like Realm of the Otherlings, Song of Ice and Fire, things like that. But it would be really hard for me to pick any individual book and talk about it outside of just, wow, I remember like this had good themes, but I don't remember really anything that happened in it.
Okay.
That's one of my reading toxic traits is yeah, it's like one in one out the other. Like that's why I write summaries after I finish books so that the next time I pick up the sequel, I remember literally anything. Uh, but yeah, I
Interesting.
mean, I feel like I can I feel like I could bullshit my way through like an hour discussion of any book, but it wouldn't be
Well,
good.
you're in academia, of course you could.
Oh yeah, yeah. There are times where I like stand up to like lecture about something and I like don't even know what I'm lecturing on, or like I get up to give a talk and I wrote it on the plane, you know?
Do you think any of your students are watching this right now?
Probably not. I hope not. But they also know that I say the most out of pocket shit on the planet. So like they would be used to it and they would not be surprised by this.
Well, that's fair.
Yeah.
I think with that, we are wrapping up this episode of the Dragonfire podcast. Thank you all so much for listening, especially through our kind of ranting, nihilistic Dragonfire segment at the end. We had a lot of fun. Thank you for being a part of this. As always, we release our episodes every other Tuesday. In the liner notes of this episode, we will have links to our socials, links to our guests, Samit Basu, whose book is coming out again October 3rd. So we'll have all that good information in the details below. Thank you so much, and we're looking forward to speaking with you next time.
Yeah. Hey everyone.